Spider-Man is definitely the most popular superhero of all time, and that's been the case for decades. Marvel's little gem, he nevertheless spent years stuck in a legal nightmare over the rights to use him. Since Marvel sold him for next to nothing to Sony Pictures in 1999 just to survive. And while today the giant Marvel has brought all its licenses back home, Spider-Man still remains the main point of tension for the entire industry. But 2026 and 2027 could mark a real turning point in the management of Captain Parker and his whole universe, because Sony and Disney finally seem to have found some common ground. An agreement where both parties benefit and which could forever change the way the characters from his incredible lore are brought to the screen. That's very good news for us, the audience. We've never really been able to enjoy a Spider-Man fully integrated into a Marvel roster. And we might finally escape the awful movies from the Sony Spider-Man universe, which, let me remind you, don't have any Spider-Man in them at all. And I have plenty of good news for you today, my friends. The possible arrival of Venom in the MCU, the evolution of Peter's story, a project where Spider-Man will finally fight alongside Daredevil, and even a brand new SSU, but this time with lots of Spider-Men we already love, the ones from the Spider-Verse. Yes, these next 2 years are going to be the best any Spider-Man fan has ever experienced. They could even mark the end of a war between two studios that, up until now, has only produced losers. So be careful, we're now entering the spoiler zone, the danger zone. You're with Kevin Buckhart, your favorite theorist's favorite theorist. Opening credits. The Spider with Golden Eyes. As I mentioned in the introduction, Spider-Man is probably the most profitable character of all time, and the story behind Marvel's disastrous decision to sell his rights is pretty funny, but I've never told you about it. So, let's start there to understand the revolution happening today, and for that, we'll rely on the excellent book The Reign of Marvel Studios by Joanna Robinson. While comics had enjoyed decades of success, the 1990s turned everything upside down with the rise of video games. Young people don't read anymore, they just watch TV now. A shock that will totally ruin the Marvel publishing house, even though it was powerful in the United States. At the time, Stan Lee, one of its most important writers, tried everything to save the company. He even went as far as reaching out to Michael Jackson, a huge Marvel fan. Yes, Michael himself. However, he realizes that Mikey has a particular hidden interest. A huge fan of Spider-Man, he absolutely wants to play Spider-Man in the movies and would like to buy the rights to the character alone.
He wanted to be Spider-Man, to buy the rights to Spider-Man. I think he wanted to play the role of Peter Parker.
Stan Lee then tells him that at the time, the characters were not for sale separately. It's all or nothing. That's when Michael suggests buying everything. But he hadn't counted on the main villain of this story. Let me introduce you to Isaac Perlmutter, an Israeli-American businessman who, at the time, owned the toy company Toy Biz. Yes, it's all in the name. Very close to Marvel for years, as the official toy maker for the franchise, he saw the publisher's decline as an incredible opportunity to do some business. He then blocks the sale to Michael Jackson and buys the studio, which was completely desperate for next to nothing. His goal is clear. He's not here to save the house of ideas, but to make as much cash as possible in the shortest amount of time. After all, emotions have always been collapsing and maybe the time of superheroes is over. But for that, he had a move to make. Him and his partner, Avi Arad. I love Spider-Man. He's my all-time favorite hero. Remember this name well, you'll see, we're going to have a good laugh. He then decides to sell as many character rights as possible to all the studios he can. The idea is to bring in cash, pay back the investment, and hope to sell toys off the back of the movies they produced. And what's funny is that at the time, neither he nor Avi Arad believed for a second that superhero movies would work. Least of all Spider-Man. Yeah, those guys really had a nose for it back then. A few months after they arrived, Universal bought the rights to Hulk and Namor. New line gets Blade, Fox takes the biggest franchises with X-Men and the Fantastic Four, and Sony manages to acquire the entire Spider-Man lore for the modest sum of $7 million. So Marvel did try to offer them a bundle of 28 characters including Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, the Avengers and so on, but Sony only wanted Spidey. No wonder! On their side, Avi Arad and Perlmutter didn't see any particular potential in the character. But then, what does this deal include? Well, for $7 million, Sony gets the film, TV, and animated rights to the entire Spider-Man universe, but with one condition. They have to regularly release Spider-Man movies to keep them. According to the leaks from the hack Sony suffered in 2014, they have to release a movie every 5 years and 9 months, with production starting no later than 3 years and 9 months after the previous one was released. That deadline can be extended if Sony releases 3 movies in 8 years, and now a lot of things make sense. Why does Sony release trilogies in such a short time? Why have there already been 3 reboots? Or even, why just the SSU? Why? Well, it's for the rights. So don't worry, you'll never run out of Spider-Man content. Sony isn't going to risk losing all that. Because since acquiring the license, the studio has generated over 11 billion in revenue. That's a 160,000% increase in value. I'm telling you, man, they've got a nose for it, especially since, to finish with them, the story doesn't end there. Because Avi Arad, who strongly pushed for the sale of these rights, is an executive producer. He's the one responsible for the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, Blade and the X-Men films, where he worked hand in hand with the studios to whom he had sold the rights. However, Avi absolutely did not believe in the idea of an internal Marvel studio. He believed making solo movies and then an Avengers film would never work. But that was until a certain Kevin Feige arrived. The young producer, who proved himself on the X-Men trilogy, was then recruited by Perlmutter, who wanted to prove to his partner that an in-house studio would work. He then challenged Feige to produce 2 films in record time, and above all, with empty coffers. Feige therefore decided to go with Iron Man and Hulk, and took on all the risk to get a bank to finance them. It's simple. If it works, they hit the jackpot. If it flops, it's bankruptcy. And you know the story, it was a huge success. Avi Arad, on the other hand, was humiliated and resigned just before the launch of Iron Man. But wait, it's not over. The next part is great. Since Avi Arad is above all a producer, he decided to start his own company to keep working with Sony, especially on the Spider-Man reboot, the Amazing Spider-Man movies. But especially in 2018 when he becomes the big boss, or rather the visionary who will launch the SSU. Becoming Kraven the Hunter by pushing Sony hard to launch this universe independent from the MCU. Yes, that's it. He had a score to settle, and even then, he completely messed up. Well, now that we know all that, we understand a bit better what happened between Sony and Marvel over all these years. A man who didn't believe in a project became the biggest success in the history of cinema, and who ended up on the other side with those to whom he had sold the rights to the most successful character in the industry, giving him the tools to mess with those who had humiliated him. And the worst part of all this is that even though the CEO of Sony Pictures had to leave and was replaced by Ravi Ahuja after the failure of the SSU, none of the real people responsible for this SSU left. So, they did fire a few hundred people under the pretense of restructuring, but Amy Pascal and Avi Arad, the main people responsible, stayed. Even worse, they're still in charge of the studio's biggest projects, including Brand New Day. Afterwards, it's clear they don't really have the same influence with Marvel anymore, because Tom Rothman, CEO of the group's motion pictures, announced that the SSU would be rebooted. But this time with other people in charge.
Where are we in the Spider-Man franchise? Not at the animated Spider-Verse. Is the larger Spider-Verse dead? Are you going to go back to those at some point? Yes, you will. But it'll be a fresh reboot. Yes, new people, okay?
So, let's hope he's really talking here about our friend Avi. And it's all this upheaval that probably changed quite a few things between Marvel and Sony, but we'll talk about the new SSU later in the video. Because before that, I'd like to go back to the MCU's Spider-Man. According to major rumors, tensions between Sony and Marvel may never have been lower. Even better, it seems that all parties have managed to find common ground, and you just have to look at how the production of the next Spider-Man is going. I made a video to talk to you about all this, but indeed Destin Daniel Cretton and Tom Holland seem to be in perfect harmony, and everyone seems to trust them. Even better, it seems that Sony is totally willing to share its license much more. Yes, Tom Holland's Spider-Man is probably the least Spidey of all the Spideys we've seen in theaters so far. No real MJ, I mean. No Gwen, no Harry, and not even an iconic villain, even though the hero's lore is endless. So far, only the Vulture and Mysterio have really been adapted, and even then, with a stark twist. I'm not counting the many villains in No Way Home who were just brought back from past movies to please fans. Everything was locked down by Sony, who wanted to use them in their own universe, which greatly reduced the possibilities and limited Peter to blending into the MCU under the guidance of Tony, or Fury, or even Strange. But that time seems to be over. Now Peter is ready to stand on his own 2 feet. Although we haven't seen him team up with Daredevil against Kingpin or seen Dormammu yet, we believe the MCU's soft reboot could change this. Already, the upcoming Brand New Day roster has expanded like never before. But also because Sony simply seems willing to give Marvel free rein in the future. Quite simply because their SSU will no longer pretend to belong to the same universe, so they no longer need to have exclusivity over the villains. Maybe we're finally reaching the end of this war that's been going on for years, with Sony constantly putting pressure on Kevin Feige, where every decision about an MCU or SSU film involving Spider-Man led to a real tug of war. Just like with the way Venom was handled, Avi Arad wanted to impose on the one who had humiliated him, resulting in a ridiculous back and forth between Venom and No Way Home. Well, ridiculous, maybe not so much in the end. Venom at Mickey's Place. In 2021, the post-credit scene of Venom, Let There Be Carnage, sends Venom into the MCU without any explanation. A moment that most likely made Kevin Feige very uncomfortable, who, in the very next film, sends him back home without a second thought. Well, in the dispute between the two studios, he still had to give in and leave a little piece of symbiote on the bar. A detail that was actually used in the misleading trailer for Venom 3, which made us believe that General Strickland had recovered that piece of symbiote. Sowing doubt between the universes, but obviously once again it was a huge lie. Anyway, so we know that Feige absolutely didn't want anything to do with the SSU universe, or the SSU universes. We don't even know anymore. Daniel R. Erpikav had even specified that there were no plans involving Venom, but that was until a report a few days ago from My Time to Shine and Leo. According to her, Kevin Feige now wants Venom for Secret Wars. Believe her or not, she's not the only one who's hinted at the symbiote's arrival in the MCU. Another insider, the redacted guy, who is actually pretty reliable, especially when it comes to Spider-Man, posted this image of a black-suited Spider-Man with the design from the very first appearance of the symbiote in the comics. So, it's not an official image from the comics, but a piece of fan art that's been very popular for years. Doesn't matter. Two things that make you think the symbiote and Venom might not be that far off after all. And that's not all. I've mentioned this before on this channel, but the actor who plays Mac Gargan the Scorpion announced his return on social media by sharing images of Scorpion and his Venom each time. Because if you didn't know, in the comics, the symbiote was linked to the criminal Mac Gargan for a while, giving us one of the most violent versions of Venom. And such an evolution could totally make sense. In my last video, I talked to you about a possible future for Bullseye in a Thunderbolts Black Ops team formed by Valentina Allegra de Fontaine. A team that could become, in a sequel to the Thunderbolts movie, the Dark Avengers, leading the current New Avengers to face off against Valentina and her group. And guess who makes up the team in the comics? Bullseye, of course, who acts as Hawkeye, but also Mac Gargan in the form of a black-suited Spider-Man. But then, how do we introduce him directly in Brand New Day? Well, old rumors spoke of a completely crazy ending, where Peter could die and the symbiote could bring him back to life. They even went so far as to say that we would see Peter's funeral, and that the famous symbiote would resurrect him in the grave, giving us the iconic cover from Kraven's Last Hunt. Yes, we know Destin Daniel Cretton enjoys recreating iconic Spidey panels and covers, and the promo already shows several elements that prove it. So, why not? But it could also be that Kevin Feige sticks to his initial decision not to include Sony's symbiote, and instead does it like in the comics, with a first appearance in the Secret Wars movie. A few clues suggest we're likely on this track. Recently, Sony released interesting documents, the first 3 script pages, handwritten by Tom Holland and Destin Daniel Cretton. They jot down ideas, respond to each other. In short, it's a great thing to share. I love it. We see elements from the trailer, especially what's in the letter and AMG, but also things that are interrupted by the famous Ned story at O'Malley. But what's even more interesting is that Peter is now completely independent and alone. He no longer depends on Stark technology at all and had to, as if by necessity, make his own equipment with whatever he could find here and there. We can also see that he has a homemade 3D printer on steroids, which we see in the trailer, and it allows him to constantly build and improve his suit. The director himself confirmed this. No, his suit is no longer made with nanotechnology. Now it's inspired by those of Toby and Andrew and has to be constantly improved or simply recreated. Because now, every fight damages it more and more. We also learn that he has developed a new AI, Evie. Well, we don't know much more for now, except for the fact that Tom mentioned she's the closest thing to a friend that Peter has. In short, what you need to remember is that his suit will take damage in fights. And we already know one thing, he and his DC character will be central to the story of Secret Wars. Even better, they will go directly from Brand New Day to Secret Wars without going through Doomsday. So there won't be any possible adaptation between the two movies. No upgrade. And probably no setup either. So Peter will enter this new universe, sure, with organic webs since he won't have anything there to make them, so that problem is solved, but also with a destructible suit. And so, just like in the original Secret Wars from '84, he might need at some point to use a costume-making machine. The famous machine that contains the symbiote, the one that will later create Venom. So, if Kevin Feige manages to convince Sony that this is the right solution, I can really see it happening this way. Unless this all happens in a post-credit scene or is totally unexplained, with someone coming out of the grave into Battleworld, honestly, that feels a bit too crazy to me. But after all, this movie is so secret that we have absolutely no idea how it's going to unfold. Especially since very soon, there will be more reshoots at Pinewood Studios in London for both Doomsday and Brand New Day. Yes, the Russo brothers, Destin, Tom Holland and RDJ all in the same place at the same time. Now, I'm not saying that Doom will show up at the end of Brand New Day. But if you ask me, the movie is still going to have a lot of surprises in store for us. Imagine at the end of the movie, or in a post-credit scene, a face-off, Doom and Peter. The hype before Doomsday would be incredible, especially with the Russo brothers always involved in developing the character. Just as a reminder, they're the ones who introduced him into the MCU, with the tough job of showing the audience in just a few minutes who he was and where he came from. That's why they chose not to hold him responsible for Uncle Ben's death. Yes, another huge change compared to his origins, but they just clarified in an interview that for them it was a way to keep him innocent with a lighter burden to bear for someone his age. In the end, it will be Aunt May who teaches him that famous proverb, with great power.
And with great power, there must also come great responsibility.
A mantra he seems to have understood more or less backwards, since today, in the famous scripts, we see that he thinks his responsibility is now to lose himself in Spider-Man and do good, no matter the cost, even if it means completely forgetting himself, just like the rest of the world. Well, all of that is in the next 2 years. But after the new Spider-Man movies, while the street level has picked up again at full speed in the MCU, Peter Parker himself has been notably absent for years. Yes, time flies, and we haven't seen Tom Holland put on the suit in over 5 years. Generally speaking, aside from the animated Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, which came out at the beginning of last year, we haven't had a Spider-Man movie or series since Beyond the Spider-Verse in 2023. That's why this year, 2026, is a real event for Spider-Man fans. Because not only is Spider-Man Brand New Day making a big splash in July, but that's not all. Tobey Maguire is also expected to return in Doomsday. The animated series, Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, returns for Season 2 this year, and the first episode of Spider-Noir debuts in just a few days. A new approach, directly as a series, inspired by the character from the Spider-Verse, and it could very well revolutionize the whole approach to Spider-Man. Because as I mentioned earlier, Tom Rothman announced that a new SSU is going to be created, that they have learned from their mistakes, and that new people will be in charge of it. But, as we said earlier, Sony has completely given Marvel free rein when it comes to Tom Holland's Spider-Man. They, who initially had strongly insisted on bringing John Watts back for a new trilogy, the Crazy Ones, finally agreed to let Kevin Feige put his protege in charge. So, something is brewing behind the scenes at Sony. Something big. Since there's a good chance the studio will entrust this new SSU to the duo best positioned to make it a real success. I'm obviously talking about Christopher Miller and Phil Lord, both screenwriters of the Spider-Verse trilogy and recently proven directors of the hit project Last Chance with Ryan Gosling. Yes, clearly, lately everything this duo touches turns to gold. And it seems that the Spider-Man Noir project they're producing is, for them and Sony, a full-scale test of what the SSU of tomorrow could look like. That is, a multitude of live-action and animated movies and series centered around spider characters from the multiverse. And from what I've heard, many creators and journalists have already seen the episodes. Everyone only has good things to say about them. What Nicolas Cage and Lord Miller are doing is much more mature and finally takes a new direction. For once, a Spider-Man project isn't made for the general public or families, but fully embraces the genre. Which Sony has never really done. Because even the Venom trilogy completely distorted a character who originally isn't just a skinny guy, but rather a monster. But that's not the only interesting thing about this project. We know that, unlike the Spider-Verse universe, this Spider-Noir won't be Peter Parker, but actually Ben Reilly, a clone of Peter in the comics. Some might assume Marvel and Sony's conflict prevents Prime from using another live-action Peter Parker. But it seems that the reason is more contractual, more related to the legal conditions surrounding the character of Peter Parker himself. Yes, when it comes to a legendary character, there are pretty strict guidelines. So no, Peter Parker can't be smoking cigarettes while shooting at criminals. If Prime and Sony want to keep this very adult tone, they simply have to change the name. And who better than the tormented Ben Reilly to take on this role? But the most interesting element of this adaptation isn't there, once again, but rather in the choice of villains selected. For the very first time, we're going to see two identical characters living in parallel in live action in two different universes, and not just any universes. In this case, Tombstone, who should be one of the major characters in the new MCU trilogy, and here in the same year appears in a series produced by Sony. A detail that seems trivial at first glance, but it confirms the complete change of paradigm between Sony and Marvel, something they had never dared to do before. To give you an example, a few years ago, Ryan Coogler dreamed of including the character Krabs, Kraven, in his first Black Panther. A request that was categorically refused by Sony, who had planned a movie about the character which would finally be released 8 years later, launching the SSU at the same time. And that's exactly what makes me think there's reason to be hopeful about the future of Spidey, or even the Spideys. Once again, that's one of the most common criticisms online about Tom Holland's Peter. His contract situation relegated him to being Tony Stark's sidekick, and with Sony's constant control over the IP, it completely stripped away everything that made him truly faithful to himself. Yes, Peter has to suffer, yes, he has to struggle in life, and yes, we want him to end up with the beautiful Gwen or the amazing MJ. And where is our Green Goblin? Damn it already, sorry. Anyway, all of this mainly opens up new opportunities, the chance to finally see him interact with other street-level characters. In the Brand New Day trailer, we see Sheila, New York's new mayor, handing him the keys to the city. Except that when you look at it, we still have Sentry who made the city disappear into darkness, and there's not a trace of Spider-Man. When Luke Cage became mayor and set up a task force that was literally kidnapping citizens, nobody. And when Daredevil and half of New York rose up against that same mayor, where was our New York savior? At some point, if we want to make Spider-Man, the darling of New Yorkers, even a little bit believable, maybe we should involve him a bit more in the life of the city, outside of his movies. And that could finally happen soon. In any case, that's what Insider My Time to Shine seems to be suggesting once again. After sharing this image again, where we see one of the final scenes from Season 2 of Daredevil, Born Again, the one where Matt is no longer alone facing Cage but is joined by Frank and Peter, she added an interesting little comment. I heard that we'll get something like this sooner than expected. And it's obviously something we all want to see. While Matt talked about an army to fight Fisk at the end of Season 1, in the end he only got help from Jessica and 3 cops. But with the full return of the Defenders and Fisk's return to New York in Season 3 of Born Again, it's possible that the whole street-level scene could change completely. Because when you take a step back, this street-level story has struggled to evolve so far. Fisk keeps losing to Daredevil, and he's tried everything. Winning as a mob boss, controlling the underworld, prison. Controlling the FBI, same thing, prison. And in the end, he even tried political power, and it still didn't work. Even though this time Matt is in prison. So I think that Fisk will have to resign himself to playing the same game as his opponents. In other words, surrounding himself with supervillains. For me, that's the logical next step for the street-level side of the MCU. The era of the Netflix mafia is over with Season 2 of Born Again and the Punisher special. I think Brand New Day will launch a new, more comic-accurate underworld. Fisk and Frank have literally emptied the city of its gangs. And now, we're talking about Scorpion, Tombstone, the return of the Hand. So there's a good chance that Fisk understands it. The game has changed. He now has to adapt to reclaim his place, which explains why, in the future, Daredevil will probably need help to stop him. Or even that the Kingpin could finally take his place as Spider-Man's main villain, freeing him from this endless Murdock versus Fisk confrontation. Some believe Fisk would do anything to bring Vanessa back, possibly using the Hand's resources. Still, it's still a bit early to dive into that theory. Sony and Marvel's relationship has never seemed better, as I said, and that's great news for us. Because at last, we won't hear that the long-awaited project didn't happen due to a 30-year-old feud. Well, that's what we hope. After Marvel reset everything in recent years to try to get back to the top of its game, we hope that Sony will finally manage to do what the fans are waiting for. And yes, betting everything on Lord and Miller seems to be the right option, and what better way to launch all this than Beyond the Spider-Verse, which should finally come out in 2027. Which itself is going to be a huge Spider-Man year with the likely return of the 3 Spideys in Secret Wars. And that's just the beginning, since Sony has already announced an adult animated film about Venom, which will be directed by Hollywood's 2 favorites, Zach Lipovsky and Adam B. Stein, the directors of the latest Final Destination. So yes, that sets the tone. Other projects are also progressing, such as an animated Spider-Punk movie and a Gwen Stacy or Ghost Spider project. It remains to be seen if the next fight between the studios will be over the character of Miles Morales. Because clearly the future hinges on a live-action Spider-Verse, or even, why not, connected with the MCU. Because there are still so many multiversal stories that the Spider-Verse saga hasn't mentioned or even touched on. One of the best of them involves Morlun and the Inheritors. Above all, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It's free. See you next week, same day and time. Bye. Ciao.